Hey, Forrest, you're
We have
muted.
no sound.
Great. Yes, there we are.
Hey, man, good to see you. I'm instead of recording, I'm doing a private live stream on YouTube. So we have this on YouTube. So it's not published, nobody's watching. It's private between us.
Okay.
And we
I
have
appreciate you letting
our
me know.
I was just reading about all the system that you're part of creating first, and then it's pirate. It sounds like a joke.
very good. So so first of all, it was really funny that after Andrew introduced us and we got this call set up last week, Forrest and I just by chance met on Saturday in a conversation online. That was really funny, and um, and also I should say hi from Jim, Jim Watt. I've been on a call with him uh, um, a couple of hours ago. We were doing this little project together, and so I mentioned that we were talking. Um, and he told me to say hi.
That's good. Yes, definitely.
So let me run you through how we usually do this. I just want to lead by saying we have no clue what we're doing. And we're trying to explore something here, and in most concrete terms that we can find. So I personally really enjoy listening to all of the conversations on the STOA and the Game B stuff and etc. But it's all on a very high level, intellectual, abstract level, and we want to bring this down to very concrete terms here. Not to devalue any of the other stuff, but we really want to get our hands dirty on this, right? So the way we usually conduct this is we do a quick round of introduction, and in that round of introduction, we let you go last because we want you to go into the flow of first in introducing yourself and then going right away into the depth of our question, which is, if you imagine, and I can repeat this later again, but I just want to set it right now. If you imagine you are somewhere in the outback of the planet, you can choose where. You know, this can be where you live, this can be Norway, New Zealand, wherever you want, but detached from any kind of current mode of civilization with 100 to 1,000 people. What do you do to build a self-sufficient, self-reliant community? Not one of these intentional communities that live off tourism or offering meditation retreats or something like this, but truly self-sufficient. So in general terms, what would you do? But also in very concrete terms, what would you personally, what would do? What's your contribution to this? What would you like to bring in conceptually, but also physically from game A? And what would you like to explicitly leave out? So that's how we do things here. So as I'm already talking, I will mute myself just now. But just once you go into your first riffing on these ideas, and then we will start coming in, and it'll be just a natural conversation about this stuff. But we want to really get you're the focus. We want to get into your views here. So just a quick round about myself, and then I'd hand it over to Florian and Lars, and then over to you. So I've my configuration is, on the one hand, we started we talked about existential risk and collapse around the dinner table when I was a kid, on the one hand, and the other part was natural sciences and the potential and power of natural sciences to do the right thing, and this is the underlying basic configuration. Originally wanted to be a rock star, but instead I discovered the internet sometime in the 90s, started coding, started seeing that this could be applied. So you just need a computer and an idea, is essentially to build something that can help. And what I saw was that money was always going in the wrong direction. And in 2003, I had a little software company, and I was in a meeting where I understood why that happened. There were two central bankers from Europe that were trying to set up a alternative currency system somewhere in Germany, and I was there because we were supposed to set up the software. Maybe you know one of them, Bernard Lietaer, and Bernard went on to explain the whole what Jim calls money over money return thing to me, and since then I've been pretty obsessed with that kind of stuff. To be able to do all of this, I have a small software company in Berlin that runs like the motor, and turning a machine, and that machine is you heard me say that on Saturday, and part of that machine is the Pirate Academy, and I think that's good enough for today now. So I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to the others.
So, and then I will go next. I'm Florian. I can't really say what my configurations are, not that precisely that Thomas did. I'm a trained artist, and now working since several years, several decades in communications, trying to find out ways how to can really help people to transform, or organizations, which mostly starts with persons. Yeah, what I'm also interested in, very personally, deep, is how can we just more, or can reconnect to nature and old wisdom, which personally I for myself find more meaningful than all the other things we are doing right now. Sometimes feels like a game, like everybody for us. Probably we just had this conversation before. We just talked about this one, and I'm really trying to learn from others how they see the world, see what their experience can make this happen. As we said, as Thomas said, this Pirate Academy is like something like a heart project from all of us. We really want to contribute something to this and add the best possible system, or whatever you will call it, idea, which is based on truly authentic experience and the best you could bring into this. And that's what I'm here for. I'm just hoping. I'm sure. So that's the other conversation where we also have so many things we can just rely on, because we're just deeply listening to people and try to connect with them. So it's always a great experience. And thank you that you're here.
I'm Lars. I'm in Norway, originally Danish. In Norway, I run a small business school that is a laboratory for how to educate in a new paradigm, spending a lot of time early in student movements and being an advisor to the UN when they did the Millennium Conference on the future of leadership education, seeing that we have built a reality and a system that is not working. And that's why I'm very inspired by your thoughts on metaphysics. We need to go back to the core and rethink the core elements of how we think and how we understand the reality, to reshape it in a new way. So that's basically the core of my life project. I've done it in academics. I've been a Buddhist monk. I've been training energy with the Chinese energy systems, basically trying to understand who I am and what reality we are into and why it does not work as I think it should work.
Okay. So I guess I can try to give some introduction to myself that mirrors a little bit of that. Thomas, I think like you, I have a background actually pretty similar in some respects. The question that you ask, I think, is quite focused, and it's something I've been thinking on myself quite a long time. And by that I mean decades, since I was in my teens, essentially. And I also have a background in computer science and natural philosophy, which includes things like physics and chemistry and various areas of mathematics and so on. I think perhaps I could actually just respond to the question that you're posing. And first of all, you made the remark that you weren't sure what you were doing, but I think the question actually itself indicates that you do. I mean, you're asking the right question, and it's phrased well, and it has to do with concrete things, and I actually really like all that aspect quite a bit. It's concrete enough that I can respond to a little more decisively than I think most people would really appreciate, because they're just not, as you said, they're thinking in abstractions at the moment. They're not really ready to ground it in a kind of reality. As far as location is concerned, my preference would be New Zealand for a variety of reasons, which we can articulate. I don't know that that's a crucial decision. I don't think that it's super critically important as far as, a lot of the stuff that I'm concerned with is appreciating. The main thing that is, I think, really essential to the question that you're asking is the sense of self-sustainability. So the question's a little different in the sense that you're not attempting to do any integration. You're doing it truly from scratch, and also clearly remaining independent, right? So you're presuming that there's no military incursions, or that you have to deal with pollution issues that are coming from outside, or secondary effects from external wars or X-risk things that are going on. So there's a few assumptions that are important as far as the question is concerned.
Let me elaborate on that part a little bit. Let us focus on exactly that. So yep. In that sense, we're a little bit abstract and unrealistic because we ignore the rest of the world.
That's right.
If we have enough time, we can venture into that land.
No, but I like the question because, while we could talk about X-risk and its mitigation, or we could talk about current civilization collapse issues and its mitigation, or we could talk about long-term conscious sustainable evolution for the planet as a whole, and by that I'm talking 1,000-year epoch time periods. That also is actually not the scale that you're concerned with. The scale you're concerned with is actually quite a practical one, which is to say, how do we figure out the dynamics of how to make the transition and what sort of things we need to account for in order to do that? So in that sense, your question, although it isn't at any of the three levels I just outlined, it's actually quite cogent because it touches on all three of those. And so in that sense, I don't find any issue with your question at all. I think the question is actually quite good. But I, for documentation purposes, want to articulate that it is actually a different question than is usually asked in these spaces. And that changes the nature of how I respond, because if I was trying to address those other issues, I would pull in certain other elements, but that would confuse the nature of the response that is needed in this space. Your question had two levels to it. One was essentially what I was sort of envisioning as essentially an ideal configuration, and then also what my personal relationship would be to that ideal configuration. So I'll need to handle those two aspects separately. You had also asked in the email about my epistemic foundations. I think I'm also going to treat that as a separate issue. It's clear that from Lars's response that you are all at least aware of the metaphysics and know that that's essentially the epistemic foundations upon which I operate. And the ways in which that informs my thinking about a lot of things can be articulated, but it's at this point probably clearer for me to just talk about what I think rather than how I got to what I think.
Yeah, I agree. And it's helpful for the interpretation. That's why it should be handled as a separate question. Yes, that's true.
Well, I'm just doing all of this as background because I sense from the nature of your asking that you're actually quite a disciplined thinker. So I'm trying to therefore be careful to kind of outline all of the pieces that are composed so that I can address this appropriately. The next piece that is, I think, kind of important is now to sort of just say, okay, the scale of the thing. So you basically said between 100 and 1,000, roughly. There's actually a critical transition in that range. So I now need to partition this. So there's a lot of talk in these sort of things about Dunbar's number, which there's a lot of different versions of the Dunbar's number, depending upon what kind of social factors you're looking at. But in this particular case, you're looking for complete sustainability, which basically means the Dunbar number of 150 is kind of the relevant one. And so if the group is smaller than that, if you have a group of just 100, the chances of actual critical complete self-sustainability are actually quite weak. So if we're talking about true complete auto-regenerative process, but also that has solved the kinds of problems that resulted in what the current world, in other words, if we're actually doing the thing that would be eventually the solution to larger world issues, we actually need to be working at the upper end of the scale that you're describing. So in other words, from the, say, 300 to 900 range, pretty much anywhere in that space, that the kind of dynamics that are critically important ones are going to be the ones that we're going to need to work with. So I'm going to provisionally say that the group can't be smaller than about 300 people, and it probably shouldn't be larger than about 900 people for the purposes of specifying what I'm actually responding to.
Are you planning to go into why that is so a little bit?
I can. It is.
I'd be curious.
So I'll do that specifically then. The reason, so if you take a catalog of all of the things that are essentially needed to be done in order to achieve sustainability, like true, genuine sustainability, in effect, that catalog itself is partly a response to just the sheer level of complexity, the level of biocomplexity in the interaction with the environment, the complexity of ourselves as biological creatures, and all of the implications that that has in terms of our relationship to other people, to ourselves, and to the wilds in general, right? So you can effectively have the category of self, the category of world, i.e. all the stuff we see and touch directly, and then the category of other, which would be all the other people that we're in connection with. So taking those as essentially kind of orientation bases for the concepts here, each one of those in themselves is complex. And obviously their interactions are also more complex because you have a kind of multiplying factor when you take two complex systems and you bring them into conjunction, let alone three. So in effect, this forms a kind of basis of what is the accounting for all of the things that need to be done in order to establish self-sustainability, right? So in effect, there's a kind of consciousness that is involved, and there's a kind of evolutionary potential that is involved. So the notion of conscious sustainable evolution is actually a real thing, coherent unto itself. But that notion has a minimum level of complexity associated with it that all aspects of which must be addressed. At least, it's necessary to address all those things. And that if we don't address some of those things, then instabilities show up in the long term. So for instance, if I take care of everything but health, then you end up with a series of degradations. So what happens is that most people's lives end up being shorter than they ought to be. You end up with a certain chaotic element of the relationships, and that limits the potentials of what you can actually do in order to stabilize the society. So in effect, there's a whole series of functional aspects that need to be addressed. And when we look at the length of that list, and we look at the degree of specialization that is possible for an individual to take on, or the varieties of roles that they can take on, it ends up being that the level of training necessary in order to create sustainability actually exceeds the carrying capacity of the people if the number is too small.
This sounds like you've done calculations on this.
I am not kidding when I said I've been thinking about this for decades.
Okay.
So basically, when you're approaching me on these topics, you may be talking to maybe one of the most disciplined thinkers on this topic in the world today. These are not trivial questions. These are questions I've really gone into and spent a lot of time about. So you've hit a bit of a live wire.
It's beautiful. That's exactly what we need. Thank you.
So yes, in effect, if you're looking at a tribe, so for instance, just to put this in the context, you can kind of get a feel for the math a little bit. A tribe could be smaller than 150 in a natural setting, and assuming that you really didn't need a lot of cultural sophistication. So pre-technology, and by technology, I'm basically saying not just the stuff that we have around us in the modern world, but basically all of the artifacts. So the fact that there are artifacts in the world at this particular point means that if one of my tribe's people wanders around somewhere, they're into an abandoned building and finds a gun, his power relationship with respect to the rest of the tribe have just shifted, right? And so in effect, if we're looking at pre-industrial revolution, sort of, before artifact of technology, so you've got to go back about 10,000 years at least, but then the complexity levels are actually strictly lower in certain senses than they would be for any civilization or any tribe that we would be trying to create today. And that differential is important because the kind of stuff that people propose in this space when talking about things like sand talk of trying to go back to our tribal roots and just reboot the code that's already there. There's a lot of merit to that kind of thinking, but it overlooks some critical issues that unfortunately make that particular approach unsolvable as it currently stands. There are some adjustments that are needed in order to handle the radical asymmetries of power that would result by literally accidental circumstances. So in this particular respect, the level of complexity that would be needed for a modern culture to essentially have sustainability would effectively need a greater level of diversification than a sub-Dunbar tribe would be able to sustain. And again, it's basically we have longer lifespans. We would want to have longer lifespans. We would prefer essentially a quality over quantity sort of consideration. We've done the quantity thing. We know how all that turned out. So in effect, if we're going to do this better and differently, we're going to need to think about the metrics a little differently as well. So there is a quality emphasis, which basically means a higher level of integrative synthesis that would otherwise be required.
So let me just sum up some of this to understand whether I'm following. So as cultural sophistication grows, complexity probably grows in some quadratic way,
yep.
Which means that the required skills and inputs require bigger numbers of people to solve these issues. And you're essentially saying we've done quantity, and quantity doesn't equate to quality of life. So let's do quality. And it sounds to me like there is some level of quantity that leads to enough quality that is sufficient and can be solved by a number that you pointed somewhere between 3 and 900.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good summary. So that's, as I said, a somewhat of a brief digression, but there's a few other critical arguments that have to do with the nature of Dunbar numbers particularly. So for instance, if you think about what that number comes from, it has to do with our mental capacity to keep track of the relationships that we have, which people don't really explore what keep track of means, but there's a mental model sort of phenomenon that's required. So it's how well I can track the social relationships. It's how well I can essentially develop trust, because I have a sense as to what your motivations are, which means I need to know what your motivations are, and I need to know how your actions do or do not track against my hypotheses of what your motivations are. So it's not just a reputational thing; it's a capacity to predict the future thing, which is essentially a basis of action. So in this particular sense, when we're talking about Dunbar's number, we're talking about a kind of threshold capacity of what the mental substrate of the brain can actually support. The level of complexity associated with creating a autopoietic, sustainable civilization as a kind of self-sustained unit out in the woods somewhere or another is already at a level that is higher than can be sustained by essentially tribal groups using the kind of mental modeling that I was just describing. So the nature of the problem-solving capacity that is needed actually has to be of a different order than that which could have been done by, say, tribal leadership methodologies, which means essentially council technique. It's not to say that council technique is fundamentally bad. It's just that it's critically oriented around a group size that's essentially smaller than Dunbar number. And we already know that the level of complexity that is required to respond to is already higher than that. So we need to actually think about governance technique of the tribe and its capacity to make decisions as a whole in a different order of way than has previously been attempted. So let's just outline quickly what are sort of the top headings of what is needing to be addressed. So the framework of conscious sustainable evolutions is actually as good as one as any, although there are several others. So for instance, under sustainability, we're thinking about 6 critical issues: clean air, clean water, food, shelter, medicine, and communication. So, and I know that list is very finite, but it's actually very specific. So if I miss dealing with some of those things, like obviously, you know, if we're out in the bush and there is, you know, no need to consider existential risk issues and no need to consider essentially history or anything else, we're kind of doing a de novo sort of approach. Obviously, clean air, clean water are more or less going to take care of themselves. We may need to pick a location for which those 2 conditions are actually true, such as we wouldn't want to be at the top of, say, you know, the Himalaya mountains because the air is too thin. But if we picked a location that has running water and it's fresh and therefore, you know, we have a bioadaptation to that particular climate and area, so people aren't getting sick because their bodies aren't adjusted to the space. But assuming that you have essentially an organic relationship to the thing, that air and water mostly take care of themselves. So now we have to think about food, shelter, medicine, and communication. I'm not going to claim to be an expert in particularly in the area of food and agroforestry and you know, ways to basically do sustainable farming and the kind of the balance between, you know, how we do quote unquote hunter-gatherer versus you know, ecological farming and such like that. Those are areas of specialization, which I genuinely feel many other people have much more expertise than I do. And the same would be true for medicine. I'm not going to claim to be a doctor. I don't necessarily know about all of the vitamins and things that are necessary. I want to say I've spent some time learning so that I can be healthy myself, but aside from a few rare circumstances, I generally don't prescribe. So my area of focus has mostly been in the shelter and the communication areas. There's not much evidence of the work that I've done in the space of shelter online, but my notebooks have a lot of thinking about that. I would say that my thinking in that space is probably not as well developed, but it's a lot more considerate than most people have been in this particular line of thinking. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about, say, how to build bricks if we're going to make houses out of brick, or how to do 3D printing of houses if we're going to use some sort of, well, we could talk about laser-centered rock and stuff like that, but those would be kind of different approaches to solving different kinds of shelter issues, depending upon a whole series of assumptions, which may or may not be applicable in the scenarios that you're describing. So I'm going to leave aside the entire shelter piece, even though that is an area in which I actually have expertise. I don't think my expertise is at this point complete enough or tested at all well enough, other than having built my own house that I live in. Not this current one, the one previously, but you know, that's years ago project, and at this particular point, like I said, that was done mostly in the modern world. So whether or not there's any relevance to building a straw bale house with, sustainable energy things in the Northeast of the United States in a way that basically was able to adapt to harsh winter climates.
So that was your previous house?
My previous house, yeah. So
was straw bale.
It had straw bale features. It had a big water cistern. It had, still has. I mean, so there were solar panels and the basically water heating systems in the roof.
Mm-hmm.
So the sunlight would heat the water would keep the building warm, essentially. Because the heat storage capacity of water is quite a lot. The specific heat is high. So it affects, for my design considerations, I was looking for an energy neutral building. So for me, the concerns that are relevant in this particular case, how to do energy neutral.
So it's to.
You're breaking up, say again.
Yeah, sorry, I have some connection issues here. I was just asking. It sounds like it's a version of Earthship, the way you set it up.
There's some elements of that. So I looked at those materials and found them very interesting. But I'm going to leave aside all of that now, because that's a whole series of rabbit holes we can go down. But for the consideration that we're at the moment, like, keep in mind, we have the partitioning of a community is going to need to handle consciousness, evolution, sustainability, or conscious sustainable evolution. We're just looking at the sustainability piece. We bisected that into 6 parts, and I've addressed all of them except for communication. My work has mostly been in what we need to do at the communication level in order to stabilize the other 2 fields. So basically, in order for a culture to, or a civilization to have, you have cultural elements, you've got infrastructure elements, and you have what we would normally think of as finance elements, but in this particular case, that's not a relevant thing. We're looking more at ecological elements. So in this particular sense, there's a kind of layering that needs to go on, and communication is the basis of what makes culture possible. It's also the basis of which makes the reason and decision-making capacities of that community possible. So that's why I treat it as a critical need in the list of critical needs under sustainability, even though the actual net effect of it is to more concretely address the consciousness and evolution aspects of that particular community.
Okay, I can totally follow that logic. I hope my connection holds up. I don't know what's happening here.
Well, I can cut my video, which might make it a little more stable.
Yeah, I'll cut mine too while I'm trying to figure this out. But I'm listening and I can follow.
Okay, if you lose connection, try chat.
Okay.
I'll see the chat window come up, and that's the lowest bandwidth communication that is possible, and that'll help to at least let us know whether we've lost sync.
Yeah, we can actually test the communication part live.
Yeah, well, it's a bootstrap kind of thing. So if I see something wrong in chat, then I'll wait and slow down until we kind of resync.
Beautiful. Okay, well, let's do that.
Awesome. So the next piece is essentially to talk a little bit more about what the other layers are. So, for instance, I mentioned that in one sense we can talk about conscious sustainable evolution. I focused on the sustainability piece, and then we went to the communication part of it. Now we can talk a little bit more about the evolution piece specifically. So when we think of the modern world, for example, we have obviously all the businesses and all the community interest groups and institutions and so on. And when we're thinking about the community as a whole, we're finding that there are essentially 2 levels on which choices are being made, right? There's the individual level of choice, and then there's essentially the community level of a choice. And that itself is actually a simplification, because obviously if there are families, then the family unit as a unit in the community may have relationship with other family units, or if there are teams, then they may have relationship with other teams. But for the most part, just to not make too many assumptions about things like that, we notice that the selection pressure that if we're just looking at it as a fundamental biological process, there's a selection pressure that operates at an individual level, and there's a selection pressure that operates at the group level. So when we say sustainability, we're mostly talking about the group as a whole kind of continuing in time. So in other words, that the community remains a community for hundreds, if not thousands, or potentially longer years.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this specific sense, there is a need to actually handle the game theory at the individual level, which current mathematics does reasonably well. But then there's another layer which needs to be integrated into the math, which current game theory formulations have not done at all. And so in effect, when we look at the co-pressures that are involved in these two levels, then we see that, again, the Dunbar's number thing comes up, because when we're talking about the kinds of dynamics of choice making that are needed, again, this factors back against the level of complexity of the choices. So in effect, there are choices that want to be made at an individual level and choices that want to be made at a group level, and that we need to, in the sense, partition the choice space of all possible choices that can be made, both individually and by the group, kind of correctly, because otherwise we would have essentially instabilities show up in the long-term process of the dynamics of that community. Is all this making sense? And
I'm following. I don't know, Florian, Lars, do you have remarks?
No, not so far. Just quite interesting how you just
makes sense. Yes,
yeah, absolutely. It's very structured. It's pleasure to
structured
follow.
Because I'm trying to essentially communicate a framework in which there is hung a huge number of ideas.
Great.
So to essentially sort of articulate the problem space and why certain things are being thought of in a certain way it's just actually a really complicated question, and so in effect, the answer is just going to take time. And by being clear about the underlying topology of the structure that I'm using to describe this, we can make refinements later, but the idea is that at least it gives us a good firm starting point and a kind of navigational framework in which we can have future conversations. So in this sense, the thing about making individual choices is reasonably well covered by biological process as it stands currently. What's not done, and not done at all well, in the world at general, and also in our usual people's thinking about these sort of topics, is how does the community make choices? And when we're talking about the community, as mentioned earlier, we're looking at communities larger than Dunbar number constraints. So in other words, how do you do choice making at the 300 to 900 person level? Quite frankly, modern civilization has not figured out how to solve this problem.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a range of issues, one of which is, as we know, there are obviously acute situations for which hierarchical leadership structures can actually respond to, assuming that hierarchy is stable in any fashion whatsoever. But there are also problems which are chronic, long-term, and have levels of complexity which are well exceeding the capacity of any individual mind or even small team to handle. And so if we're not going to have a situation of reaccumulating existential risk or civilization collapse issues, then the choice-making capacity of that group is needing to be able to handle issues of long-term, high complexity questions, as well as obviously short-term, simple, obvious, acute issues.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, far more of the important problems are going to be in the long-term, high complexity space, without obvious simplifications, than not, because again, the number of simple, clear, obvious situations are relatively few in the total problem space of things that need to be addressed. So there's a kind of statistical argument that can be made there to establish that, but I'm going to leave that as stated for now.
Okay.
So in effect, the area that I've worked on the most is how effectively to have large groups make choices that doesn't lead to the kind of corruption dynamics that would naturally evolve otherwise, given the biological built-in propensities of human beings as a species. So in effect, there's a lot of neurological and biological processes that are operating that have been part of our genetic heritage for a really long time. And these create certain biases and certain thinking patterns and certain patterns of activity that, although well adapted for certain circumstances, are not actually that well adapted for the needs of the situation that we're describing. So there's a certain number of compensatory techniques that are needed when talking about group choice-making process, such that the biases that are apparent at individual levels don't emerge into a kind of sociological bias and therefore compromise the capacity of the group to be genuinely responsive to changes in the environment in which they are embedded.
Okay, let me catch up and see what I'm following. So you're breaking it down all the way to communication as a core element to stabilize the conscious and evolution part of the conscious sustainable evolution. And you're then further breaking it down between individual and collective choice making. And you focus on the collective choice making because individual choice making is fairly well understood. Whereas on the collective choice making, we still haven't figured it out. And you see two dimensions, the short-term concrete and the long-term complex dimensions of choice making in a group. And within those, I think I'm not sure where you want to focus on. Is it both? Is it one?
It's typically the long-term complex choice making.
Okay.
So in effect, while I have said that the world hasn't figured this out, I have essentially devoted the last several years of my life to figuring out how to do that. Mm-hmm. So in one sense, my contribution, and this is, first of all, your summary and model of how you're understanding what I'm saying is correct. So I appreciate the discipline that you clearly have to follow all that. So in this particular case, the first space of contribution that I feel that I can uniquely make is to actually be able to talk cogently about what is needed for a community of individuals to do sense making about the problem space, do choice making, and to do action response, basically to have the sort of OODA loop at the group level. So, observe, orient, decide, act, but not at the level of individuals, but at the level of community. So in other words, distributed, decentralized, high coherency sense making that has a very strong anti-corruption feature built in, so that it's very, very likely that the right thing that needs to happen is actually going to happen, which is that, the group asks effective questions and has insights and so on. And then the second piece is, again, distributed choice making, also decentralized, also high coherency, also in ways that are corruption resistant and more likely for good choices to happen, for a well calibrated notion of what we mean by goodness, right? So truth, beauty, and things like that. So in effect, when we're looking at the action enablement piece, where choices actually get implemented, again, we're looking at a distributed, decentralized, non-corruptible, methodology that ensures that the intentionality of the community is actually represented in the totality of the collective action of the community. And so these are three separate problems, but they are interrelated with one another deeply. And to really essentially implement a collective governance of the people, for the people, by the people, et cetera, then in effect, you really need to actually handle each of those aspects well, and to essentially compensate with real knowledge of what the underlying biological substrate upon which this thing is built. So the communication practices in the group itself actually turn out to be the basis by which the reason and capacity to have reason and reasonableness at the level of the group itself can actually occur. And so in effect, most of what my work has been over the last several years is essentially understanding specifically how to do that.
So I think I can follow. There's a question though. I really love the beauty of the construction. But have you seen this in action? So where's the concrete applicability in the real world?
So there's several places.
Go ahead.
So for instance, you know, and when we keep in mind, we're talking about partial implementations. If you look at the governance structure of a cooperative organization, like a big co-op, like if you go to Nelson, Canada, for example, there's a co-op that has several hundred active participating members. You know, again, the structure of that organization follows along somewhat conventional lines as far as co-ops are concerned, but the overall dynamics that are emerging in that particular space, although they have, as I said, entanglements with commercial culture and all the rest of that sort of stuff, have elements that are demonstrating some aspects of some small aspects of what I'm talking about. You look at cooperative governance at, say, the national level of Switzerland, for example. Again, you see some elements of this stuff manifesting. What I'm basically talking about is a far more comprehensive approach. And when you start looking at those particular levels, it starts getting less and less likely, of course, because you know, we're genuinely doing something new that hasn't been done before. And part of the newness is a direct result of technology itself, and also because of a much deeper understanding of the nature of the biological than we've ever had. So to some extent, some of the methodologies that have been developed in this particular space haven't had a chance to even have been tried, simply because they literally have been developed in the last 3 years. So the EGP process, for example, has been tested 3 times and has produced results that are actually in excess of what were very pessimistic assumptions on my part. It turned out to be. So,
EGP stands for
ephemeral group process. It's layer 2 of this. You know, there's a sense-making aspect where the community is essentially attempting to come to know itself as a community and to orient with respect to choice-making process that it is going to be engaged in later. So, in effect, it's a prelude to other methodologies to essentially enable a community to become aware of the issues that matter and respond to those.
So that would be a concrete implementation of the research and work you've done in the past years and maybe decades. The EGP, is that right? Okay.
Specific, yes, it's a specific group practice, and by group we're talking, you know, 300 to 900, as I indicated earlier. That has the features I mentioned, which is the distributed, anti-corruptible, asynchronous, and so on. So, you know, in effect, there's some concrete implementations connected to those sorts of things, but the issues themselves come up. You know, you're asking a specific question about what would it take to create a sustainable, independent breakaway civilization.
Yeah.
And what I'm basically describing is essentially a general technique that would be needed not only in the situation that you're describing, but also to respond to any large-scale critical issue at a world-class level. So, for instance, say, for example, we wanted to address deforestation in the Amazon, or loss of coral reefs, or industrial farming, or pollution issues, or, you know, things like nuclear armaments or whatever. There are a lot of entangled actors. There's a lot of different interests and concerns that apply. There's a highly distributed geographical impact, as well as responsiveness required. And so in effect, to you know, say a billionaire wanted to donate resources to essentially addressing something like you know, Amazon rainforest in some positive way, he would want to know that the money that he was investing, you know, would actually have an impact that was beneficial with respect to that thing, which means that you would need to have a group of people, a team that's implementing a project. But more than that, of course, like an entire community of people involving several hundreds, because that would be the minimum number of stakeholders that would be involved anyways. And in that particular case, in order to ensure that the resources invested weren't diverted to private interests or to things which were basically not connected to the underlying objective for which the investment was made in the first place. And by investment, I'm using that word weakly, by the way. It's not like the benefactor is going to get any sort of return, but that if a donation is being made to the commons and to the public, that it actually remain in the commons rather than in private interests or essentially diverted to other things which are relevant.
Yeah.
So in fact, you would need a governance structure for that group that was genuinely trustworthy, not with respect just to the donor, but with respect to the participants themselves and each other, as well as to other groups that might be observing them to see whether or not these things actually happen. So in effect, the problem of effective governance is essentially a necessary and critical one if we're going to address anything in the space of long-term conscious sustainable evolution, or in the space of X-risk, or in the space of dealing with civilization collapse. So that's why I focus my attention there, because with the metaphysics, it's essentially the only tool set that had enough epistemic coherency necessary to address the problem space sufficiently well to actually identify a proposal for a solution that could actually address all of these underlying concerns.
So now let's move over to New Zealand, into some forest, and we have our, let's say, 600 people there, and not everybody will follow what you're describing here. How do you go about getting this type of group coherence that enables you to have these types of coherent decision-making processes?
Fortunately, it's not required for everybody to understand it. In fact, it's not even required for very many people to understand how it actually works. What's more needed is essentially a kind of cultural process that embodies a kind of habits of communication. So, for example, when we look at how people in a tribe communicate with one another, or how people who are in intimate relationships communicate with one another, and so on and so forth, we notice certain features, so certain balances of reflective inquiry versus advocacy or social advocacy. And so in effect, if we are looking at this in an intergenerational way, obviously I'm not going to be able to take a group of 600 modern people at random and have this thing sort of boot up without some sort of educational process occurring. But the educational process, of course, there's a means ends thing that we need to account for here. Conventional education methodologies are going to result in conventional understanding, and as a result, that's not actually going to get us enough leverage, as you point out, for any of this to actually work. Instead, we need to look at an earlier system that's maybe still familiar to some people of how guilds work. So instead of trying to treat it as essentially a function of society in a separated sort of way, to think about education, we're talking about it actually in a culturally integrated way, where there's essentially an experiential practice of how communication not only can actually work, but needs to actually work in order for a culture to actually be that, a civilization to actually be that. Looking at again, 600 people in the woods somewhere or another, keep in mind we're kind of on we're beyond tribe, and we're in the space of a town or a city. And so in effect, in order for us to really have coherency at this level in a sustainable way, we're effectively needing to basically think about this in the same sort of way that we would want to if we were to say, how do we make a city stable with respect to its environment? So in other words, one of the points that has been made in this space, particularly with regard to civilization endurance and so on, is that when we think of the notion of civilization, we're really actually thinking of two components, one of which is the notion of civility, and the other is the notion of city. And if I disregard either the notion of city or the notion of civility, then the notion of civilization has no coherence as a concept. So in effect, we need to think about what is needed in order to ensure civility as a phenomenon. This goes back to communication and cultural embodiments. But we also need to think about what's necessary to sustain a city. So for example, to have a city be able to endure for thousands of years without, again, assuming, ambient natural resources which can be consumed in a non-renewable way. If we are genuinely looking at true sustainability, then there are three balances that are required. One is a cultural balance, which we've sort of alluded to already by saying that if systems of inequality emerge, as they naturally will unless there's compensation, and by compensation, I'm talking about structural compensation, not monetary, anything. But if we're looking at wide-scale social imbalances like class structures emerging, or in-group, out-group dynamics, or the kind of stuff that normally goes wrong with social process, which is very, very easy to go wrong without really understanding how to deal with those sorts of things, then obviously the city's not going to endure. It will fission and split and so on. Whereas if we are, assuming social sustainability, then the next issue would be essentially, as was mentioned, the kind of ecological sustainability, in the sense that if it degrades the environment in which it lives and can't produce food, then the city itself or town or tribe or whatever obviously isn't going to endure, because it has effectively divested itself of its substrate. And then the third aspect is essentially an energy balance. So it's the notion of a city has a kind of metabolism. Any community has a metabolism. Any biological creature has a metabolism. And if we don't think about the flow of atoms in space and ergs in time, then we haven't really considered how to navigate the potentiality space as to essentially have long-term endurance actually adhere. So in this sense, in order to have city be sustainable, we need to get energy balance, we need to get ecology balance, and we need to get social balance. And we have to get all three of those right in order for city to be sustainable. In order for civilization to be sustainable, we now add the ingredient of communication practices, which of course include things like education, which, as I mentioned before, would want to have more an embodied practice in the sense of guilds. So, and that's just a reference to a historical notion of how this was done previously. Obviously, in this new thing, because we're talking of not necessarily a different economic model, but essentially an actual ecological model, then to some extent we're going to need to, we almost have to develop a new way of thinking about language in order for this to make sense. Fortunately, going to that extent, it's not quite required, but it does involve a large number of concepts, which at this particular point would not necessarily be obvious to people, but which become obvious in retrospect once a person has had a chance to explore some of these issues in depth.
So you're saying there needs to be habits of communication that then give rise to the needed culture of communication that leads to well-informed sense making, choice making, and actions.
That's correct.
And the way you want to create habit forming is by education in a guild system.
Education in the sense of relationships between older people and younger people.
Okay.
So in effect, if we think about intergenerational knowledge transmission, again, for a culture to endure, it needs to pass or transmit the tools and techniques of how that community is in the world from the existing generation to the next generation, and for that generation to be similarly empowered to pass it on to successor generations. And again, when we say the word generation, we're talking about it as if it was a discrete phenomenon, but as I'm sure you know, the whole thing's happening asynchronously because people are having children at the rate that they do. So in effect, there's an underlying dynamic here of thinking about communication in both the intra-generational and intergenerational sense. recognizing that both of these are fabrics of process rather than discrete events.
So I can follow this again on a theoretical level. Now back to the 600 in the woods. Who do you equip first with what knowledge in order to kickstart that process of the subgroups that do the education, and how does such a subgroup / guild work?
Okay, so keep in mind, you're actually asking two questions. One of which is, what does long-term conscious sustainable evolution look like?
Mm-hmm.
The second is, how do we transition from where we are to that state?
Mm-hmm.
So far, most of what I've been describing is the inherent requirements and characteristics of what is a sustainable state.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
The transition dynamics are a whole layer in addition to that, because it's like building a bridge. If I know where to put the footings on both sides, then I can build the bridge between them.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm thinking about the bridge, which is the visible element, without thinking about the footings, I don't really have a sense as to how the bridge works.
Makes sense. Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, while it is very, very practical and very, very reasonable to be asking about transition dynamics, to really be able to even start that conversation, to some extent, I've got to talk about the footings.
Mm-hmm.
So I've mostly been talking about what the far shore footings look like.
Okay, got it. So in order to establish the full picture of, let's say, the bridge, of the communication that you're describing, what else would you put in place of the footholds of the bridge that you're
This
missing?
conversation is a good start, because you see what we're doing in our communications, we're orienting with respect to one another as to what each of us has already done. You're mostly asking about what I've done. At some point, I'm going to learn more about what you've done. And so in effect, what we end up with is a kind of increase in our sense-making capacity as to what needs to be done in order to move any of this forward. In my own case, thinking about these questions myself, because I recognize that as a single individual in the world as it is today, that mostly what I can do is to essentially understand what would an appropriate future look like, and then from that figure out, after having reverse engineered what is sustainability, to then figure out what is transition dynamics, and then after that to figure out what can I personally do to enable those transition dynamics to that future state. So in a sense, there's actually a third question, which is what can we do to make that happen, right? So in effect, the net result of that process, if I'm going to just jump ahead and skip all the other pieces, is that mostly I've been writing software and documenting what I've figured out as far as the principles of how to think about these kinds of issues. So while I don't believe that I myself possess the knowledge or intelligence necessary to solve the world's problems, I do believe that what I can do is to essentially contribute to the conversation in a very strong way, to essentially enable a community of people to have the capacity for themselves to build the capacity so that they have the capacity to make choices about how to do long-term conscious sustainable evolution, because it's beyond the capacity of any one person to do that.
Okay, got it. But just one question about this. So it's a recursive bootstrapping process, and that requires
it's an entry point. It's recursive, but it's not without it's not regressive. So in effect, I can actually talk about how to bootstrap into the sort of group processes that would enable themselves to essentially instantiate transitional dynamics. So
yes,
we know where to start the conversation. We know how to get it going, and then we end up having to sort of compensate for the local conditions of what the modern world looks like right now, and some of the dynamics that imposes on us as far as even figuring out how to bootstrap the transitional dynamics.
But doesn't it also require coherence about directionality?
Well, to some extent, yes, but not completely. You see, the thing is that I don't necessarily need agreement about all the techniques or all of the sort of stuff. It just needs to be enough to bootstrap the conversation so that the level of coherence that's needed can emerge. Fortunately, it's not like there's no need for consensus. I mean, there's consensus processes and they're good and so on for what the things that they do, but obviously they have limitations because they're very time consuming. But the main thing is that you're really looking at a kind of hybrid approach that enables essentially the advantages of the things that we've learned as a species so far to be still had, but also for us to transcend some of the limitations that we've discovered along the way. And so in effect, the insights that come with that enable new classes of conversations to occur that allow for coordination that currently doesn't appear to be possible, but actually emerges as being quite easy to do once enough of the conversation has actually happened. The main limiting factor at this particular point is not so much whether it can be done. It's more a question of can we even bootstrap the communication dynamics necessary to create the level of interest and commitment in the modern world, because most people are quite frankly distracted by the spectacle of the internet. And so in a sense, there's actually some real resistances that are just part of our current modern world that make some of this difficult, but they're artificial difficulties. They're fortunately, once a certain level of understanding is reached, it becomes actually quite a bit easier.
Okay. You mentioned some implementations of the EGP.
Yeah.
And I understand those as experiments of that whole concept. And you mentioned that some of them.
One tiny part of it, yeah. So think of it as like an engine. I've tested the alternator.
Okay.
Obviously we're going to need a lot more stuff than just an alternator to build a car. But if we need a vehicle, having a coherent notion of how to build an engine is a real good start, because it allows us to understand how an alternator is important and works in context. Except that when you're asking about complete sustainability for 600 completely independent of the world, we're not looking at an automobile, we're looking at an aircraft. And quite frankly, not one that needs a runway, but one more like a helicopter. So, in that sense, there's some specific requirements that are going to emerge that are particular to helicopters that wouldn't necessarily be true of, say, a truck. You've asked a much more disciplined question than most. So I'm giving you a much more disciplined answer than I typically do.
Thank you. Yeah, it's I can almost hear my brain crunching as you're talking.
It's mine.
So, no, it's mine. It's yours too, Florian. Okay.
Yeah, mine's is loud. Mine's an old one. Mine's in an engine, so that's why it's so loud. I just want to ask one question in this one, because I imagine sitting in this in the forest on the ground with the people, and you said in the when you just start the conversation about this process,
which is people, and you put them on the ground without any preparation whatsoever, they will die.
Yeah, exactly. So now they're sitting there and waiting for some out of like starting point, and you said, okay, the first question is looking ahead and saying, what is it the future we want to head on? And then we can just start the conversation in small groups and trying to figure out what everybody can contribute. But there is to be something which is, how's the structure? How is it working on? How is it going from the start point from, okay, now we have to find ways to make decision making? And how is it going?
That part's already part of it. So for instance, if you look at how colonies form, so, just for example, and again, because I live in the United States, I happen to know its history a little bit. But and even using these examples, I take the risk of offending really large numbers of people because colonization has become a really hot political topic these days. But you know, if you're thinking about the Puritans kind of you know, running away from European rule because they want to have some independence and kind of start over and strike out again, which isn't too different from, you know, essentially what you're describing, right? You're basically talking about a breakaway group that tried to achieve some sort of sustainability. So, and you know, with a kind of ideological sense as well, because you know, we kind of recognize that things aren't going so well in some respects, and that we need to really understand how to deal with that. So, if we look at the Puritans, for example, coming across the ocean and, you know, arriving in the United States and then basically trying to carve out a life in the wilderness,
by a gun,
it's not actually that different. So, but of course they didn't have the advantages of you know, a complete knowledge of, well, not a complete knowledge. I mean, obviously we're never going to have complete knowledge, but the a much more nuanced understanding of psychology and of health and how to build insulated buildings and so on. So in effect, we would have advantages that they wouldn't, because we have a much higher level of education to start with. But if you just look at the Puritans as it actually happened, the first thing that they constructed was usually the church. And you know, the church is an educational device. It's also a governance device. It's a community refuge if, you know, it's storming out. It's all sorts of things at once. But specifically, you notice that the emergence of infrastructure comes out of culture. And this is a really, really key point, because you know, you're asking about how do we get to the point where we have infrastructure on the ground. And my point is that what infrastructure emerges is a reflection of the culture that generates the infrastructure. So if we're building things like houses for people to live in, or as I mentioned, educational methodologies, or community places where people can get together and figure stuff out, you know, then to a large extent, we really need to understand what is the culture that is doing the building, because what gets built is going to be defined upon the value systems of that community, because it's an investment of energy and it's a return on investment in the sense of that community's sustainability. So, you know, on one hand, we can talk about it as culture, but it's not just, you know, a free-for-all kind of thing. It actually needs to be somewhat coherent, because if the investment of time and energy isn't actually well conceived at a cultural level, then that cultural obviously won't be sustainable. So in this particular sense, if our notion of the bridge from here to there is going to be actually well-founded, then to some extent that means that we need to do enough of the cultural work so that when people arrive, that they already know what to build, rather than having them figure it out on the ground, because it's going to take time for that level of coherency to emerge. That's why I said, if you just take a bunch of people and put them in the middle of the desert or in the woods or whatever, none of them are going to have the survival skills necessary to actually endure as individuals, let alone as a community. So in this specific sense, I'm basically pointing out that in any community context, the communication is actually a full third of what needs to be done. And it's a modern thing for us to underestimate or de-emphasize that aspect. If we're going to build infrastructure, there's a coordination element that's needed for that to happen. And if we look at the requirements of what's needed to actually have that coordination be real and not an illusion, not some sort of aberration of bootstrapping hidden things that we've taken for granted about how we think today, then we need to essentially account for the fact that there's a huge amount of at least implicit communication that is involved. And that if we're going to move it from unconscious process to conscious process, at least sufficiently conscious that it goes from reaction to choice, i.e. moves it from a machine type response to an actual human response, then we're going to need to actually account for the fact that there's a embedded level of communication that is fundamentally required and just cannot be escaped from. And so, you know, on one hand, while I completely appreciate the need to think about this in absolutely concrete, manifest, embodied, on the ground terms, bear in mind that for every way in which something is embodied, there's two ways in which it's abstract. And for every way in which something is abstract, that there are two ways, distinct ways, in which it's embodied. And so, again, this comes from a sort of metaphysical principle. I'm not guessing about this sort of stuff. I'm telling you this stuff, I'm making claims. I'm not making claims because I haven't thought this stuff through. I'm making claims because I've thought this stuff through with enough rigor to basically say, it's possible to know for sure that some of these things are the case. Now, again, I'm not going to try to convince you of any of this, but I will try to create the conditions for which, things like action bias can essentially show up as a sort of predisposition that on one hand is corrective of a lot of the talk and don't do things that people do a lot, but it's also corrective of the do but don't talk thing that can also happen. And then there's yet a third category of mistake that can occur too, but we'll get to that some other day. The point is that the main thing at this juncture is to just make sure that in this process, if we're really looking to answer the questions that you're asking, that the balance between talking about it and doing it, in a sense, wants to be understood as in a right way.
Okay, so first I want to remark that it is very interesting and also very affirming that in all of our conversations we somehow land on this point that you're pointing out, that culture is key, that it's not so much the physical infrastructure, but that actually follows culture. Now we had a similar conversation with Tyson Yunkaporta. You mentioned his book. I don't know if you've had a conversation with Tyson about this. But in that conversation, he made a very interesting point that I personally only first really viscerally understood in that conversation, which was that the land dictates, at least to a certain degree, the culture. So we were now talking about woodland, but there's a woodland would create, just because of the living conditions and the necessities to deal with survival in that specific environment, create a different type of culture than, let's say, a more arid land or mountain or waterland would create.
This is true, but there are still there are underlying features which would be the same. So, for instance, yes, there's definitely variation, but there's also similarity. They're all going to have hearts and lungs and kidneys, and the structure of the nervous system and the bones and the immune systems and so on. There's a certain series of functions which are going to be present in all the bodies. In the same sort of way, there's going to be a certain set of functions that are going to be apparent in all cultures or in all civilizations. So, in effect, there's an element that is responsive to the environment, right? People have different skin, they have different characteristics and abilities and so on, but they also have some similarities which tend to be overlooked. And so, in effect, what I'm basically saying is that if we take a stand back, somewhat dispassionate view, and really look at the fundamental, what is necessary, what is sufficient, and what is comprehensive, complete in that sense, then in effect, the proof methodologies that we use to establish necessity, and the proof methodologies that we use to establish sufficiency, and the proof methodologies that we use to establish comprehensiveness are going to be distinct. They're different methods. And so, in effect, if we're looking at cultural dynamics and its interchange with the environment and trying to figure out things about what's allowable to be similar and what's allowable to be different and so on and so forth, we actually have to understand the drivers of that pretty well. So, I agree with his point, which is that you can't really think about culture independently of ecosystem. So, in effect, there's a kind of what I would call an axiom 2 cycle. If we basically extend the model, like if we say, well, what does culture rest on? So in the same sense that infrastructure emerges out of culture, culture itself emerges out of the biological substrate of the ecosystem and the human bodies that are in it, both, right? And so that's the layer lower down. But if we go up a layer, like we at this point would say, well, out of infrastructure emerges things like what we would think of as monetary systems or marketplace trade theory, or the usual ways in which we have cultural concepts like religion or governance or government, perhaps, and those are different, by the way. And then marketplaces. Those are things that essentially rest on infrastructure. You don't really have an institutional model without having institutional infrastructure. So in effect, that layer emerges out of, and however we want to use that layer, like I said previously, I said it's at a certain point we need to rethink the notion of marketplace in some very specific ways, and I'll talk about that a bit later if you like. But the notion here is that itself has an impact on a whole lot of other things that can emerge out of it. What we think of as the abstract knowledge of institutions like universities and such, the body of knowledge that I'm working with and so on. Or you can essentially say that institutional layer itself has a feedback that influences both infrastructure and culture and actually the ecology that it rests on. And this, in effect, is one way to describe the nature of the problem, which is that the influence that institution is having on ecology is wildly destabilizing, such that the ecology collapses, which means the culture essentially collapses, or that the culture is collapsing because the institutions aren't really preserving the culture. The institutions, businesses, particularly surveillance capitalism and all that sort of stuff, are effectively divesting culture of its capacity to be culture. Communities are breaking down, fragmenting. You have atomization of the individual and so on. And so in effect, we have, particularly as far as the demographics are concerned, here in the United States, an actual breakdown of the cultural carrying capacity, even in intra-generational sense, let alone an intergenerational sense. This is the crisis that is, at this particular point, already well established, although not necessarily conscious to the majority of people, which are actually embedded in it. Believe me, that'll come. So there's a phenomenology here, which is that, because of the unconsciousness of the institutional impact on ecology, culture, and even infrastructure, if you look at the economic models for towns and cities, again, I'm going to use the United States because I happen to know it. Most of those towns are basically just about to go bankrupt, and a lot of the cities are over the next couple of decades, because the infrastructure that they have is far more expensive to maintain than the tax base of the town that is living there. And so as a result, maintenance isn't going to happen, and that basically creates a cascade of issues, which essentially results descending into third world conditions, which is the American future unless we turn this around. So in effect, there's a need for us to essentially understand that there is a cyclic dynamic that connects upper layers to lower layers, not just in a causal feedback way, but in a much more comprehensive fashion. And that if we're going to do civilization design, whether in a break-off sort of way or in an integrated way with the modern world, we actually need to understand the dynamics of that cycle rather well. So at this particular point, this is why I'm saying, while a lot of people are talking about abstractions as a way of avoiding doing the real work of essentially, solving some of these particular problems, and they're doing it for social influence or political reasons, or to try to basically benefit themselves as individuals, to show up as great thinkers in this particular space. Very few people are actually doing the work. And I appreciate the question, because it indicates an earnestness to do the real thing rather than the show and tell and look nice sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you. That's at least what we're trying to do. So if I understand the cycle correctly, out of the biology, so both the bioregion, and the human body, emerges culture. And out of culture emerges infrastructure and institutions. And
Out of
these
infrastructure emerges institutions. So treat those distinct. So the institution layer, the marketplace, the government, the whatever the group does as a group emerges out of the infrastructure layer, but it's distinct from it. Money's a virtual concept, not an embodied one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I got it here on my notepad. I have it exactly like this. So culture leads to infrastructure, leads to institution, and then the effect of the institution on the biology creates this recursiveness.
Yeah, there's going to be a recursiveness regardless. The difference is whether that recursiveness is structurally coherent in the sense that it's sustainable
exactly.
and adaptive. So in order to have it be sustainable and adaptive, you need that recursiveness to be conscious rather than reactive. Currently in the modern world, it is completely reactive. There is no consciousness at all. So in this particular sense, there is no actual adaptation to changing world circumstances, even when those changes are anthropogenic.
That's probably the best definition of sustainability I've ever heard.
Well, this is a side effect of the metaphysics. The metaphysics is itself the most powerful epistemic system ever developed in all of time.
Okay, this is really cool. Thank you. This is a really important insight for me for today, definitely. But so let's ignore the transition dynamics and go back into the woods and say we're 50 years have passed. We somehow managed the transition.
Right.
What does that look like for those 600 people? So your kids, grandkids live in that space. How did they? What does that look like? Very, very concretely.
Great. This is the right question, and I appreciate now that we've made all these distinctions that I can answer that question more cleanly than I would have been able to prior to all this. So, very specifically, there are okay. What I'm attempting to do is actually at this moment to also answer the parts of the question which I not only can't answer but wouldn't want to. So in effect, I need to sort of distinguish between the answerable parts and the unanswerable parts. And the unanswerable parts are unanswerable for good reasons. So while I just spent a lot of effort talking about culture and so on and so forth, I actually want to talk about the parts of culture which are like I need to partition the notion of culture in three ways. So one way that I can do that is I can basically say there's song, there's text, and there's code. The song part of culture is what we would think of as being the art, the language, all the sort of stylistic elements, individual expression, the music, obviously song is music, but I'm thinking about it in a broader sense. I'm expanding the notion of song to include literally all of the unique factors that distinguish a community that is in the desert versus one that's in the woods, as you mentioned earlier, right? There'll be some things which emerge that are particular to the environment, that are also particular to that group of people and the actual experiences that they've actually had in the real lives that they've lived. And that will be unlike any other individual because every person's got unique experiences and unique phenomena that happens in their lives. So the culture is going to have elements that we will not be able to predict at all. That whole thing, I'm going to just call song. Now, I can provide a more correct, abstract, but comprehensive definition of this distinctions later. But I just want to give you a feel for how they work at the moment.
Okay. Yeah.
So the text piece is basically what we would think of as all the knowledge parts. So what we know as facts, know about ourselves, know about the environment we're in, know about other people, but for the most part, what we care about is the environment. So in other words, things that we would consider currently to be mathematical knowledge or knowledge of physics or knowledge of chemistry or just, sheer biological understanding. Let's just take that entire thing that is now independent of history, independent of individual people and so on and so forth. Let's just call that body of knowledge text. It's basically static. I can add to it, I can erase it, I can change it, but for the most part, it's like a book. You write the book, it stays on the shelf, and when you pick up the book later, the text that was in the book is the same text that the author wrote. The words don't change. They sit there until you pick it up again. Okay. Then there's code, which is essentially something that most people don't really have any understanding of, but I'll need to describe anyways. Code in the sense of how we think about it in computer science, but more also specifically in the sense of how we think about causation. So what we think of as science and technology is essentially a field of understanding and a body of knowledge that is all about modeling what causation is out there in the natural world, but also what causation we can actually utilize to get stuff done. So the field of technology is essentially applied causation theory. And so in effect, it's where the text knowledge turns into actual executable, it happens. So it's the thing that builds the infrastructure. It represents the capacity to move from idea to action. So when I'm talking about code, I'm really talking about two worlds. I'm talking about how the world of text becomes alive and creates the capacity for song to be possible. So out of code emerges new worlds of song. Same way that a virtual reality can be created in, say, World of Warcraft or whatever other EVE Online or whatever other games a person happens to be playing on the internet these days. So in effect, the online communities, Facebook, Twitter, and all the rest of that stuff were all built out of code. So anything that people do as personal self-expression in those online communities is essentially based upon the limits and the capacities of the code, which itself is defined strictly in terms of causality and things like mathematics and physics. So, if you're looking at Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency, it depends upon a mathematics, which depends upon an immutability of the physics of execution and microchips. Then somewhere along the way, we're going to actually have to account for the fact that code is very different than song and very different than text. Now, I mention all of this because for the most part, when people talk about culture, they conflate these three things. I am not going to attempt to define anything in the space of song.
Okay.
I create the methodologies that allow for text to be created and to act as a intergenerational transmission. And most of my effort has actually been in the space of how the interchanges happen, how song becomes text, how text becomes code, and how code supports song. So when you're asking about what needs to be done at a cultural level, there's specific things that need to be done at the code level in order to enable cultures to essentially build infrastructures. So in effect, I can talk a little bit about the kind of infrastructures that emerge, but I can talk about them in terms of their functions and maybe a little bit in terms of their forms. But I can't talk about the specifics because obviously that's going to be highly influenced by the song. And I can't define the song in advance because it's unique to every place. So in this specific sense, I'm basically outlining the areas I can answer to and the areas I can't and wouldn't want to, and that nobody can answer to. Right? Because you want the culture to have freedom to be itself, to essentially have an organic truth to it. In the same sort of way that the notion of freedom means, to some extent, you leave the person be so that they can make their own choices, because that's what love's about, right? That's how we have relationships. So, and that's a whole other series of conversations if you want to do that. But the main thing in this particular case is that when we talk about what it looks like, I cannot talk about the cultural elements as classically understood. I can only talk about the song and text parts of it and how those work. So in other words, how the interrelationship between the sustainability piece, the evolution piece, and the consciousness piece actually work. So, for instance, I can talk about the right balance between man, machine, and nature, right? Because if we're looking at essentially something that's going to work, now remember at the beginning I said there's different ways of partitioning this. I use conscious sustainable evolution, but I said there's others. One of the others is the relationship between man, machine, and nature. What most theorists get wrong in this particular space is that they try to think about man-nature relationships, and they completely discount the effect of machine. But as a result of machine, we have all of the X-risk scenarios, which wouldn't have been applicable without machine, and obviously all the ecological and civilization collapse issues, which also wouldn't be applicable without machine. And furthermore, it's the fact of machine and technology and science and so on and so forth that is effectively destabilizing of what would have otherwise been successful tribal solutions that we would still be doing if it hadn't been for the emergence of agriculture and all of the machine stuff that came from it. So in this particular respect, what I can basically say is that while I can try to describe some sort of idyllic scene of, people farming in the fields and singing Kumbaya in some festival hall or stuff like that, none of that is actually the interesting parts. Yes, we need to have a community that has its own capacity to produce its food. We need a community that has its own capacity to produce energy because to some extent it is a metabolism. And so without actually trying to describe the cultural elements, what I can do is I can say what's necessary to have civility and city actually work. So in this particular sense, because most people understand the dynamics of, well, you actually have to figure out a way to make food and you need to do it in a way that actually works. And a few people have looked at the infrastructure issues of how to build ecologically sustainable houses using natural resources and how to basically deal with, energy movement and so on and so forth if they're thinking about that sort of stuff at all well. So as a result, I'm going to address the things that most people leave out, which is how to essentially stabilize the man-machine relationship and the machine-nature relationship, right? Because again, most philosophers of this sort of stuff really just don't have any coherence about that. Although I'll mention as a specific exception that Alexander Bard is thinking about this quite a lot. But
sorry, I didn't catch that name.
Alexander Bard. He has
Alexander Bard. Yeah. Okay.
Anyways, so he and I have been chatting a little bit, but at this particular point, I feel I understand his model much better as a result of a number of conversations. But there's a lot of stuff that we're still figuring out. But anyways, at least with respect to just how one another thinks, so I can't really comment too much on his work. But what I can do is I can basically say that for the most part, both of us agree that the people literally are not comprehending that we really need to actually understand the balance of the relationship between man, machine, and nature much better to solve this problem. So I'm now going to go beyond that. I'm going to now start talking about the explicits of that relationship. It's currently the case that man thinks that nature serves man, and we do that because we have a very taker relationship, a very extractionary relationship with nature. This obviously has led to deforestation and lots of other issues, but if we're going to have a community that has a relationship with nature more sane, then we're going to have that relationship in a sense be a little more reciprocal than it is currently, first of all, right? And then secondly, we have, again, as a species, the naive assumption that because we built the machines serve us. So in effect, if I have these three triangles, nature extracts, we use machines to extract resources from nature. So nature serves us, machine serves us, and we're the gods of the ecosystem, and we think we can get away with that with impunity without actually understanding the ethics of God, which, by the way, is a whole other category of conversation where we talk about a foundational non-relativistic ethics. It's actually grounded. But that would be making a level of claim that at this particular point would exceed the capacity of this conversation. So at this juncture, I can basically point out that obviously in a triangle of that kind, that's not going to work. So we need to, in a sense, set up a cycle where, yes, there's a flow from nature to man, but it's not as unidirectional as it is currently. There's also a flow from man to machine, but it's a lot more flow from man to machine rather than from machine to man. And much more specifically and most critically, there's a flow from machine to nature that machine supports nature rather than degrading it as it currently does. And that's the one arrow that is absolutely the most crucial. So in effect, of the 3 arrows that are defined in the diagram that I gave a minute ago, we are now basically reversing the flow of 2 of those, so that the overall gestalt is from machine to man. I'm sorry, from machine to nature, nature to man, and from man to machine in terms of the supporting dynamics.
Okay.
So looking at what does the future civilization look like, or what does the community of people on the ground look like? There is a certain amount of technology that's involved, minimally involved. And so in effect, to describe this, I need to basically say how to understand what is the precise right level of the degree to which machinery is integrated versus not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, makes sense.
At this particular point, I can point out a couple of things which are actually quite helpful. One of which is that we've already invented everything that we need. We don't need anything new to be invented in order to make this work. Secondly, the level of
just 1 second. I agree, but I cannot tell you. I cannot tell you why, because I don't know. It's just an intuition, but we could have said that same thing 100 years or 200 years ago, and
no, not true.
No,
we
okay.
can only have said this somewhere in the late 1980s.
Okay.
So, and there are specific reasons for that. And this is where we start getting into spaces where hardly anybody has followed so far. So remember I mentioned earlier that there are some biological processes that are basically built into the human condition, and that one thing we can't really do is we can't necessarily change the genetic code of the person. I know there's lots of people who will talk about eugenics and so on and so forth, but quite frankly, most of them have literally no idea how to think about ethics. So there's fundamentally a need for us to reconceptualize the nature of the problem by recognizing that we can't change the human and we can't change nature. And the game theory and the math of the game theory is going to be the game theory of the math of the game theory. And so in effect, the number of things that we can actually influence that will make a difference, the tool set that we can use, is actually quite limited. So in effect, we know that we can make this work by changing cultural dynamics in a very specific way, but the nature of the cultural dynamics that we are essentially shifting towards has to account for the reality of all of these other aspects. It's not going to change the laws of physics. It's not going to change the mathematics. It's not going to change the human condition, and it's not going to change the ecosystem. So in effect, the thing that we can change is actually just one part of that overall balance of those factors in relationship to one another. And so as a result, we actually end up with some very precise and very specific constraints on what is essentially going to work within that space of I guess what you would call the engineering conditions of design. So in this specific respect, what we are therefore pointing to is that I actually need to understand the way in which human biases naturally result from the psychological process of brains in bodies, in the evolutionary context that we have arrived on this world, such that we account for the sociological biases that will inevitably emerge without compensation for those specific aspects. So I want to point out a couple things. One is that the kinds of conditions that we're faced with as a species have never occurred in nature before, right? So there's some elements that evolution could not have anticipated or prepared us for. So our biologies are good at living in tribes. We know how to do communication. We've learned how to adapt, features of our vocal systems to actually talk to one another. We've learned how to adapt our sexual behavior and our selective behavior of survival characteristics and so on. But there are still some things which are not necessarily going to be mutable at a biological level. And so as a result, there's a reason why cultures have come and gone, why civilizations have come and gone, and why our current civilization is unstable. And so, in effect, without compensating for these kinds of things, it's very, very clear that we're just going to have a succession of increasingly larger failures until eventually we blow the whole thing up, which is the danger of existential risk that we currently face.
Yeah.
So we don't have time for safe to fail probes in this particular space that the way Dave Snowden would talk about it. We actually need to get the right answer the first time, and we need to get it really good. We need to really know what we're doing. So in this particular sense, I'm going to be actually quite adamant about the clarity that is needed in order to essentially compensate for the human condition such that we can solve long-term chronic problems which our current governance structures aren't capable of dealing with, because quite frankly, they don't emerge by accident and they wouldn't have emerged by evolutionary process. We actually have to treat this as a kind of transcendental design. And the epistemic toolkit to do that is metaphysics. And at this particular point, I've used that toolkit to sketch out how to actually compensate for the biases that would show up psychologically and sociologically that would prevent a system of a community of a breakaway civilization from actually being civil and actually being able to build sustainable cities. So in effect, the level of recursiveness that is needed essentially encompasses a kind of compensatory dynamic that on one particular hand is responsive to the biological process, but isn't essentially bound by it. So in one sense, the machines have caused the problems, right? We've used machines in such a way as to cause all the ecological issues for why we even need to be having this conversation in the first place. And fortunately, although a few years ago I would have believed this is impossible, I've actually figured out a way to solve this problem.
Okay.
There's a way to use the machinery to compensate for the issues of the biology. And there's a way to use the issues of the biology to compensate for the issues of the machine. And without having a level of sophistication of both of these that is essentially well matched to the other, it doesn't work.
But isn't that where there's still invention needs to be done? Because when I think this through, I arrive at a similar point, and then I arrive at a notion where I want to use the current still existing platform of possible invention to invent the kind of machinery we need to get this done. And
Great.
what I arrive at then is new materials. So just to put it bluntly, growing our solar panels in a bioreactor instead of digging it out of the ground.
Yes, exactly. But the idea here is that in effect, the knowledge that we need is mostly already available. It just isn't evenly deployed.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is a whole area of research that I have myself also been deeply, deeply interested in. Exactly what you're talking about, right? How do we make biological solar panels is a question, but I'm also looking at more specifically, how do we support the level of compute infrastructure that is minimally necessary in order to stabilize governance process? Because the thing is that I spent a bit of time trying to figure out how to essentially stabilize governance process, because that's, one of the key components of how the recursiveness actually happens. It's the consciousness piece. So in effect, if we're going to get the consciousness piece right, we need a certain amount of compensation for the things that have, throughout all of time prior to this particular point, have inevitably pulled it off the rails into things that just fail. Not quickly, but inevitably, right? Mm-hmm. So in effect, if I'm going to actually handle that, I need enough of the right kind of machinery. And so in effect, part of what I can do is I can characterize actually fairly concisely the level of machinery that is minimally necessary in order to be sustainable, and the level of machinery that more than that is actually disabling. So in other words, there's there's a Goldilocks zone of too little versus too much. And up until, I don't know, maybe a few thousand years ago, too little was the problem. But fortunately, it wasn't that big a problem because we only had tribes to worry about. But then cities emerged and modern civilization emerged, and now it is a problem, right? Yeah. So in effect, the level of technology that was needed and the way in which it was used and deployed and so on and so forth is, first of all, it was too low for a really long time, and then it immediately became too much, right? And now we have way the fuck too much of it, okay? So in effect, what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, here's how we know that here's how we can know that we do know what the right level is. Okay. Here's how we actually use the level that is the right level in order to achieve the right balance between man, machine, and nature, as I described previously. And here's the kind of infrastructure that we would need in order to support that, and the kinds of cultural dynamics that we would need to support that themselves would be supported by the machinery, the computer infrastructure that I just described. And by the way, it doesn't look like much of what's around right now. It looks a lot more like stuff that was around in the 80s. So in effect, there's a sense here in which I've figured out how to compensate for the twin pillar problems of technology is toxic and people are predators, which is a whole other conversation. There's limiting conditions which you need to satisfy as if they were full extent problems. So in other words, it's not perfectly the case that technology is toxic. It's not perfectly the case that people are predators. But if you look at it from a fundamental structural and biological point of view, it is that case enough that there is essentially no real way to address these issues unless we solve those problems as if they were perfectly true.
Just one question to that. Did I got it right that you said that there's consciousness needed just to make this recursiveness? Yeah, thanks. Happening. So, and this one is not available at the moment in this extent we need. And therefore you need, you would say that there is something like a computer system you would just implement?
So there's a certain amount of infrastructure that is needed to have the translation occur. So remember earlier I talked about distributed sense making, distributed choice making, and distributed implementation. So in effect, I need to have the community come to know what the community values are. I have to have the community become conscious of the choices that it's making. And I have to have the community embody those choices. In other words, actually enact those choices. So the community needs to sense the world, to think about things, and then to respond to the world as a community, right? So in effect, distributed intelligence. Now, in order to stabilize the dynamics of that distributed intelligence, there's certain preconditions that are required. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there needs to be a kind of anti-corruption aspect. So if you put any kind of representative system in place, and this is like one of the great failings of modern governance, is that they only know how to do it with representative systems, because quite frankly, nobody solved the Dunbar problem until yours truly. But in effect, there is a fundamental dynamic that is needed to have distributed intention actually work. That is an execution layer that in a sense is not intermediated by person. It's intermediated by machinery. So in effect, the thing about code, and this is probably one of the single most important things to understand, is that machines have no intentionality of their own, but they can represent intentionality. So in the same sort of way that text can represent knowledge, machines can represent intention. So in effect, if I actually want to implement distributed intention, I need distributed technology to do it, because I need to not have it be the intention of a person, but the intention of the community, which means I can't set it up as representative of persons, because the biological substrate and so on and so forth, there's no way in which an individual can actually be tasked with that process. So in effect, what we end up with is that in order to actually have distributed process actually be distributed, you need a certain amount of infrastructure in order to have the code be able to represent community intention, because that is literally the only thing that can. And this is the big difference.
To me, there's one concept shining through all of this, which has to do with distribution. And I get the notion that true distribution of the various levels of a functioning society and their interconnectedness lead to a complexity that gives rise to an entirely different type of game dynamics than we have ever experienced. Is that roughly what you're describing?
Yes, that's correct. So in effect, what I'm doing is I'm describing simultaneously the new kind of game dynamics, the theory that supports that, what it looks like, and what are the necessary and sufficient conditions to enable it. So there's I mean, just please understand the sheer level of work that was required in order to even be able to have this conversation.
We do, and we appreciate it a lot.
Right, yeah.
I mean, what we're basically talking about here is some of the most advanced and sophisticated thinking on these topics that has ever been done in all of time. Nobody's attempted anything even remotely like this ever before. So in a sense, there's a need for us to get this right, but to do that, we actually need to understand what we're doing. So I'm articulating a whole constellation of concepts in a very abbreviated summary form, to try to give a sketch for what some of the key junctions are. So this is the thing is that, you know, in effect, we have simultaneously as a species, we've simultaneously overestimated the level of technology that the planet can endure. And at the same time, we have seriously underestimated the level of technology we need to support the level of communication necessary to make good choices with a level of quality sufficient, minimally sufficient to actually solve issues that we are actually faced with. So in effect, there's a problem domain that requires a minimum level of sophistication to be responded to. And that minimum level of sophistication makes demands on communicative process that effectively exceed what is biologically available to the individual, but can be through the augmentation of certain levels of machine process. And I'm not talking about cyborg or anything like that. I'm basically just saying enough infrastructure to support the communication dynamics so the community intention can actually become conscious, coordinated to the point of actual implementation such that the community itself can respond in a conscious way. And what, in effect, I'm trying to describe, you know, not so much the way in which we build, you know, the digestive system, which is also part of that, but the way in which we build the nervous system, but more specifically, the way in which we build the immune system. And so in a large number of respects, there's a kind of reciprocity between the immune system and the nervous system that effectively provides support for the digestive system in a way that is, I guess at this particular point, is seriously underappreciated. We tend to undervalue the immune system by a substantial margin. We tend to seriously underestimate the level of communication needed, and we therefore misunderstand the supportive dynamics that are actually needed to be in place in order to have these other functions actually function. So as a result of that extreme level of unconsciousness in terms of the thinking that is involved in how to put together a sustainable community that currently exists, I'm therefore emphasizing the parts of the knowledge which are available to me, which are not available elsewhere and need to be in order for this to actually become possible. So therefore, my response is, as you can see, I've sort of outlined the scope of the problem, and then I said, I'm not going to address these things, I'm only going to address this. And here's a little bit of why, but this is what I'm doing. And then I partitioned that again. I said, okay, of these 6 things, I'm not going to address these parts. I'm only going to address this part and this part. And I'm going to put this other part aside for a while. I'm only going to address this one of the 6. And then to address this, I'm now going to partition it again, and I'm going to show that I can address, these 2 parts, but not this one. But I'm going to leave this other one aside. I'm going to just drill down here. So in effect, what I end up doing is in the conversation is I'm articulating the thing that no one else can, that makes it possible for us to actually make the whole work, because a lot of the other pieces already exist or can be developed more easily than this part, which is in some senses the single hardest part to do.
Yeah, I agree. And that's where we also arrive, where we obviously haven't spent as much time as you in deep thinking. So this is why we're grateful for you sharing all of this. I must say, I don't know how the others feel, but after 13 hours in front of my computer, I can feel my focus is slowly dropping. So I think for today at least, I would like to slowly bring it to a closing. But I really enjoy this. So if you are up for it, I think there are so many levels where we could deepen this conversation and could have more of these in the future. But
that sounds great.
That's great to hear. But before we close this, really, there's one thing I'd really be curious about, just as a rough outline and rough sketch, because you must have thought about this, and I'm pretty sure you have some sort of a plan. So the question is, how's the currently best, in your view, best path towards implementation that you are trying to follow and implement in concrete terms?
I'm trying to basically document the methods by which sense making, choice making, and implementation occur. Mm-hmm. Build systems. I'm writing software. I wish I had a team of engineers working for me, but at the moment, there's a lot of aspects about that are important too. But essentially, at this point, I'm trying to document my research. I'm trying to build the system that would allow for this governance architecture to be tested and refined to the point that it's actually practical. Mm-hmm. Then to essentially coalesce a large enough pool of people that of that there's a subset that both understands and has experienced firsthand the sense-making, choice-making, and implementation methodologies, such that they can start to use that to plan how to actually embody themselves as a breakaway community the way you just described. Mm-hmm. Except that I'm not really so concerned about breakaway so much. I'm more concerned about instantiation of some number of these, which can then federate to become supportive in a mutual way.
Yeah. I agree. The breakaway part is mostly for.
Thomas, can I ask one?
Yeah. Of course you can, Lars. I just want to finish that one thought, or the description that Forrest was just giving, by asking. Are you in contact with or familiar with the people from Radical Exchange and Democracy Earth?
Not particularly, no.
Specifically Radical Exchange, I would like to connect you with Matt, one of the founders. I think there could be a good match for what you're looking for. But over to you, Lars.
This was a pure joy. Just to be in the brain of such a distinct and clear thinker that categorize the thinking so that you can actually dig into such a complex field. That is amazing. But I have one final question, and it might be rude to ask it, but as you think so clearly and in categories, and you have a mathematical brain that is amazing, how does the planet look like in 20 years? What is your image? Just to finish the night with, what is your most precise image of the planet in 20 years?
Well, on our current trajectory, it doesn't look very good. I think that there are some possibilities the trajectory may be altered, but there's a lot of momentum in the system. So I don't know. I know what the current trajectory is, and I know kind of what the risk profiles are. I don't know which of the existential risks were likely to have been triggered by then. But the scenario of what it looks like in a sense varies a lot on how you assess the specific risk profiles. So in a sense, I can prognosticate, but I can basically say the level of risk is already unacceptably high, and the level of damage is already unacceptably high. And in 20 years, both of those factors are, if anything, substantially worse unless we change course. But changing course requires a level of understanding of a fairly large portion of what I've been talking about today, and that's a lot to ask. And I don't know whether or not I can get enough people to essentially understand any part of this to essentially know how to change course in a way that could actually help.
From how you are argumenting and thinking, everything is connected here, and it's a huge and complex system. But if there will be a radical game changer, what do you think that first and most important game changer would be?
I unfortunately, I only heard parts of that question. Could you repeat?
I think if we agree, we see the same scenarios, of course. And then I'm just having the question, if there should be a significant game changer to the course of history, what do you think will be the most important first game changer if it should change the course?
So you have a horrible connection.
Did you hear it, Thomas?
Not really. You keep
I guess I
dropping
got
out.
it. I guess
Florian,
I
you
got it.
go.
It's something about when there's a game changer for this worst case scenario just pointed out and we all agree on. But if there would be a game changer, the most sufficient one or the efficient one, which one would it be?
Probably a shift in the way we think of an IP law. The notion of intellectual property right now is so thoroughly broken that we barely have a sense of being able to navigate this. The notion of how we think about as a species, the notion of choice making itself, the governance itself, those are fundamental game changers. But if I had to pick a specific thing right now, I think IP is the most disabling.
You really need to speak with Matt. I'm gonna send an intro email right after this. Matt, one of the founders of Radical Exchange, he's a lawyer and he's been focusing on IP and property rights, and they're trying to reinvent the way we do governance and democracy.
Well, that's great. I would suggest that if you're going to introduce us, then you can do the email, but follow up by creating a Zoom call and scheduling that between the three of us, and then actually describe to him why you're introducing us, and then describe to me why you're introducing me to him, and then tell him what question you would have me ask him and what question you would have him ask me, and that would be a strong introduction.
Okay, we'll do it.
Trying to bootstrap things here because if you want to make really efficient use of time, then that's what it's going to take.
We'll do it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So as far as next meetings are concerned and so on, I would suggest that, obviously you want to think over this sort of stuff for a while. I know that you've taken the recording on YouTube.
Yeah.
what I would suggest is that if at all possible, please have that transcribed and try to do a service and have somebody listen through to make sure the transcript is accurate.
Mhm.
Right. So we usually transcribe every conversation I have.
Okay.
So I've recorded this conversation as well. So,
Mhm.
but because you already have a recording, I can basically make this request. I can put you in touch with my assistant, who will help and assist with this. We have a very small team that can basically do some of the transcription work. But honestly, if you take on the load of the transcription, you solve two problems at once. One is that you end up with a text that allows you to kind of review the things that I've said, because there's a lot that I've mentioned that refers back to different things.
Mhm.
And I know that there's some things that although I spoke them weren't understood on the first pass as deeply as could be. And that's not anybody's fault. That's just how the human mind works. Nobody remembers more than about 10% of anything that went on.
Mhm.
But I can tell you that I was communicating at, somewhere close to 80% efficiency, which basically means that there's a lot more content than it was possible to be received.
Okay.
So to the degree that you actually firsthand listen to the recording and check the transcript, you do two things. You make the transcript useful to me,
Mhm.
and you make the transcript useful to you. But I personally would love to have a transcript that I knew and could trust was accurate, because at least more than one person had listened through and made sure there wasn't any crucial statements that were missing. But it would also save me and my team a huge amount of time, and it would allow me to publish this conversation on my website. Obviously, I'll redact names and I'll strip out identifying details and all that other kind of stuff. But it makes it possible for us to extend the conversation to other people who want to become part of this, who weren't here today, who you think might be wanting to be interested in this sort of stuff. Not a lot of people go to my website, but if it's up on that sort of thing, then you can bootstrap future conversations with past ones. And this becomes a game changer for a lot of the capacities that we want to have in order to actually maybe make something happen.
We actually have a similar process on our side in place, where we have a back office team, so to say, some students from Lars's school, and who I'm supporting with their master thesis from another school, who are going to look at various of our conversations and extract what we call the nuggets, or the key concepts out of those, which in our view adds more value than a plain complete transcript.
That's correct. But
yeah.
But in order to do that, I want to start with a transcript so that I can throw away the audio and therefore do the extraction of the nuggets.
Okay, got it. I cannot promise you speed on this, because we're all an all volunteering team, so there's nobody really working full time on any of this. But since we're pretty mission aligned, I'm pretty sure we can get this done.
Great. I'm not so schedule sensitive, but I do suggest that it's helpful to have that available with enough time that people can read it before a meeting in which they're participating, so that they at least know the conversation we've already had.
Mm-hmm.
That allows them to come in as peers rather than as trying to catch up.
Okay. So we will do the preparation for the next meeting and set that up. I'm really glad about this first meeting. I think see that there's a lot of directions to deepen, and I after getting to know us a little bit here, I also believe that there might be some more clarity on the avenues we're trying to understand and follow, in order to get some more clarity on how to really go into the implementation on the ground in concrete terms. Also, as you say, so in our next conversation, I would love to at least build towards that level of concreteness more, or dive right in if possible.
There's definitely places where there's research that still needs to be done. things that haven't been figured out, I wouldn't feel comfortable moving forward to implementation until a number of those specific problems were solved. But I do feel that there's, first of all, I appreciate the volunteer thing. I think that's awesome. But I'm basically working on this close to full time. But as you can well imagine, the research front of things that I'm trying to look into to solve problems in this particular space is enormous. I'm basically trying to take on roughly the equivalent of something like 27 lifetimes worth of information. So it's a little much to bear, and as a result, my operating speed tends to seem really slow, although I actually work quite fast. But I'm working on so many things that none of the projects move forward quickly, which everyone else basically seems, it doesn't seem like much on the outside unless you ask me a clear and discerning question like you did, at which point you discover there's a shit ton of stuff that's actually happened.
Yeah, totally. And we'll take some time to digest, and I'm really looking forward to the next one already.
Great. It's awesome to meet you. Thank you for receiving all that and being clear enough to have been able to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a pleasure. And as you said, it's worth it just to go to it at least one time more. So I guess there's several levels where I have to explore right after that. So thank you for that. And looking forward for the next one.
Awesome. We'll chat with you again soon.
Hope to.